Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone this afternoon to Navigating the COVID-19 Crisis. This is the 6th webinar in the series that CASE has been providing to our membership as well as other educators across the nation. As you can see, we have some new panelists today, and it's my pleasure to introduce those to you. Heath Heine from Kansas. Heath is our Professional Development Chair. Kindel Mason is our CASE President-elect from Idaho. Dr. Adam Leckie is our CASE Publications Chair from Arizona. And we have Myrna, of course, with us again, Mandlawitz, our CASE Policy and Legislative Consultant from Washington, D.C. And I'm Phyllis Wolfram, your Executive Director for CASE. Please know, though, that Erin, our President, Erin McGuire from Vermont, and Kevin Rubenstein, our Policy Chair from Illinois, and Julie Weatherly from Alabama with Education Solutions, is also standing by. They're on the webinar. They will be doing some of our questions. We have been promising you to get to our questions, and we will be doing some of that today. As you look at our agenda, we will do an update from Washington, D.C., but our focus is shifting a little bit today. We're going to talk a little bit more about practice in the field. Our new panelists, Heath, Kindel, and Adam, are currently directors in local districts. And so we're so excited to have them with us today to be presenting. So thank you guys for joining us. And we're going to start with our next slide, just sharing with you a little bit about CASE for those of you who may not yet be members. We are the largest division of the Council for Exceptional Children with close to 4,800 members. It is the professional organization of choice for special education administrators across the country. Our mission is to provide leadership and support to members by shaping policies and practices that impact the quality of education. Our members work with parents and families on the front lines of special education on a daily basis. So for those of you who are new, if you would like more information about membership, please be sure and visit our website. That is at the end of the PowerPoint. You'll be able to see that. We also want to remind you that if you're tweeting throughout today's webinar, to be sure and use the hashtag #WeKeepLeading. We have received quite a bit of traffic there, and we hope to be trending again today with, again, the hashtag #WeKeepLeading. I want to remind each of you about our 4 priorities. Number 1, we like to keep these in front of us throughout this entire time as we are navigating the pandemic across our country, to continue to focus on the safety, the health, and the welfare of the students and staff members in your community. Second priority is to provide FAPE. It is our responsibility to provide a free and appropriate public education, to deliver those services to as many of our students as you reasonably can and in the best way that you know how during this very unprecedented time that we're providing services to our children. Number 3, to document your efforts. Make sure documentation is focused, it's consistent, detailed, and demonstrates what we know to be that good faith effort to provide really good services to our students. We know that sometimes that's a struggle, and we know that some of our families are more stressed than they might normally be and might not be as available. And sometimes our teaching staff is not as available because they are taking care of their families as well. But to do your best when you are documenting and documenting what those circumstances bring to you. And 4th priority, of course, is compliance. We all know that the IDEA was not built for this type of situation that we're in, but to do your best to comply with those regulations. And again, document what those efforts are with your ability to comply. So at this point, I think I'm then going to turn it over to Myrna, who is going to give us a little bit of an update. So Myrna, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Phyllis. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Happy to be back with you today. Kevin, if we can go on to the next slide. Thanks. The first thing this week, this past Wednesday, Our little team did a wonderful briefing on Capitol Hill. Usually that means we actually go to Capitol Hill. Of course, this time it was virtual. And we did a webinar that really reflected the letter that we've sent to Congress and the letter that we sent to Secretary DeVos talking about those targeted and temporary flexibilities in IDEA. We invited, just for your information, all the education staffers and members across Congress, and we had a very good cross-section of staff people join us, including members, committee staff members from both the House and Senate Education Committees. And we've gotten some very good feedback already for our recommendations. The second thing I would mention is that we're gaining some traction on those requests. Senator Murphy from Connecticut, a Democrat, and Senator Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, sent up a letter to Secretary DeVos that reflected some of the things that are actually in the Case NASD letter, particularly around extending those timelines and understanding that flexibilities will be needed. So I think that we are gaining some traction for our recommendations. I sort of look at what we have put forward as being the reasonable compromise position, and I'm hoping that we will see most of what we have asked for come out in the report from Secretary DeVos. As you'll see in the second bullet there, that report, if you'll remember in the CARES Act, the Secretary was required to report 30 days after the passage of the Act on any possible flexibilities that she thought would be necessary in the IDEA, in ESSA, and in the Career and Technical Education Act. And that due date for that report comes this weekend, actually. I believe that we are expecting to hear something possibly on Tuesday, or at least the report will be transmitted to Congress on that day. I'm not exactly sure when it will be released for public consumption, but as soon as CASE knows, we will certainly pass that information along. And those recommendations will be sent to Congress, and Congress then will have to negotiate between the House and Senate Education Committees and the Appropriations Committees on what flexibilities they will actually implement going forward for those laws, including the IDEA. Yesterday, the Secretary released the pot of money from the CARES Act that's known as ESSERF, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Relief Fund. That is the $13+ billion pot of money that will be going out to state education agencies and then down to local school districts. The states have until July 1st to apply for this money, and once they receive the money, 90% must flow through, at least 90% must flow through to the local districts, and the SEAs can then retain 10% for any sort of state level activities. The money is slated to go to K-12 public schools and public charter schools, and the money can be used retroactively to backfill for any expenses you've had since the state of emergency was declared on March 13th. The Department of Education has said they will obligate these funds within 3 days of receiving the application or approving the application. Of course, that doesn't mean that school districts will see the money that fast, but the idea is to get this money down to the school districts as quickly as possible. I'll also mention that this past week, or a week ago, the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund was also released. That's an additional $3 billion, and the governors are looking at that for the most part as money that will fill gaps for K-12 and higher education, which has its own pot of money. I will also mention, because we've received this question, that that governor's pot of money can also be used for non-public schools. So it's time for you, if you haven't already, to go up the chain of command and let your state superintendents and the governors know what the need is for these pots of money, particularly to the governor's offices, because once this pot of money is distributed, Congress is already working on another package, and we are hoping that there will be targeted funding in there for IDEA. And the more information that the governors have about that need, the more they can advocate on Capitol Hill for those pots of money. I'm going to turn it over to Erin now, and if you have any questions later on, I'll be happy to try and answer those.
Myrna, thank you so much. Thank you for your advocacy on our behalf in Washington. We are better with you at our side and are deeply appreciative of the information that you always provide to us. With that, Kevin and I would like to spend a little bit of time in between presenters answering some of the most frequently asked questions from our webinars. So Kevin, I have a question for you. Are we legally in the safest position to do nothing for any student, given the requirements of IDEA?
So that's a really good question, I think, Erin, because right now, I think as we've been hearing and reading about school districts across the country, there are a lot of school districts that are in really different positions. And so what we've been talking about over the last several weeks on our webinars is the idea that we shouldn't really be focused so much on the idea of compensatory education. And that is because of the fact that the virus is that compensatory education is a legal remedy for when school districts have failed to provide a free and appropriate public education to students with disabilities. And in this situation, it has been, for the most part, the virus that has caused school districts to not provide, FAPE to students in the least restrictive environment. So what we're seeing though here is that over the last couple of weeks is that some school districts have been either slow to start or they have started and then stopped again. And so those sorts of things are starting to put some school districts probably in a little bit of peril, I would say. And so are we legally in the safest position to do nothing for any student? I wouldn't say that that's legally the safest position. As we've been talking about on all of our webinars, we should focus certainly on priority 2, which is to provide FAPE to as many students in the best way that you know how. I heard about on the news this morning about a superintendent in rural Southern Illinois who is working with his teachers and other staff members to mail homework packets basically to every student on a week-by-week basis. So you can imagine the amount of planning and prep work that is involved in all of that. And so as you're thinking through these things, you've got to just keep in mind that we still have to provide some level of specialized education and think about what the end result is going to be there, so that in the end, as you are thinking about what we actually did provide, that you're not looking at all of those compensatory education pieces. So hopefully that is a helpful tip for you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. We're going to now hand it over to Kindel to talk a little bit about services in rural districts during COVID-19. Kindel is a director in Idaho and has a great deal of experience in this area. Kindel.
Thank you, Erin. Well, before we get started, I kind of wanted to go over what rural means. Rural is defined as having a lack of public transportation, how far we might be from a metropolitan area, the size of the nearest city, the density of population, and environmental factors such as a lack of stoplights or even a lack of sidewalks. But the second part of that is to remember that there's also frontier. And frontier is defined as an average of less than 7 people per square mile. So in Idaho, of our 44 counties, approximately 20% of our population lives in a frontier county. So in essence, you could say that almost 20% of our population lives in a place where we have more animals than people. So we're beyond rural in many places, and I know other states are in the same boat. So we even go beyond rural. But before we got started, if you change the slide, Kevin, please. Thank you. Before we got started, in our rush sometimes to solve problems, even in IEP meetings, I see it a lot. We always jump to solutions. We always jump to weaknesses. And I know in our district, as we were moving forward, we kind of forgot about some of the strengths that our rural and frontier areas have, that are not always unique to just rural areas, and also urban areas have these. But I'm trying to stick with things that are more unique to our rural areas. So one of our big strengths is our relationships with families. You know, we tend to already have those close relationships with our families. We eat at the same places, we go to the same sporting events, we worship at the same churches. In some cases, there is only one church. So we already have those relationships with families, whether they're good or bad, but we do have those relationships. We know the family makeup. You know, that is the good and bad part about our urban areas. We know more about somebody else oftentimes than we know about ourselves. But that's something to capitalize on, because as we're reaching out to families, we know which ones may need more support than others. And Julie Weatherly said this in an earlier webinar, and if you haven't watched those earlier case webinars, I would urge you to go back and watch those. Is relationship with families is going to be key as we move forward into the next steps of this. Kevin already talked about compensatory ed and what that might look like. But as we move forward and we're all trying to figure this out, that relationship with families is key. And in the rural areas, we can really capitalize on that. The second strength we have is we have close ties to the community. When we need a baseball field built, people show up with equipment like backhoes, tractors with buckets, and they go to work. And so we need to rely on our community to help us identify needs and strengths. So for instance, we needed masks for our kitchen staff, for our paras that are helping deliver meals, and our bus drivers. And we put out a request to the community, and we have more masks than we can use, and we're now giving them away to the larger community next door. The other strength we have is we're nimble. We're like a special operations group in the military. We're quick, we're agile, we can move quick. And so we can make decisions, and it's not like steering the Titanic. We can actually make decisions in a much quicker manner. And for me, what I really like about that is it also gives us room for mistakes. If we make a mistake in the rural setting, we can correct that mistake pretty quickly, or in a larger system, sometimes that's not the case. And then in the rural areas, there's that get her done mindset. You know, we're used to going without. And so we always have to dig deep, figure out how to solve problems, reach out to families in the community, you know, to get her done. You know, there's a saying where we live, and that's if you can't fix it with duct tape and baling wire, then it can't be fixed. So just remember that get her done attitude as you're reaching out to your families and students in this time. And if you could go ahead and change the slide, Kevin, thank you. So the challenges to overcome, you know, our case priority number one is focus on the safety, health, and welfare of students and members in our community. And that has to be in the rural areas, as well as everybody, a key component. Our hospitals could easily get overrun. You know, we do not have the doctors on call, the nurses, the system to hold large amounts of people if we need to, if they get infected. So this has to be one of our first priorities. Our school staff, you know, if they get sick, some of us only have one teacher in these frontier areas, and there wouldn't be any services to provide. So that really has to be our main focus. You know, we've had some people come from the bigger cities to come buy products from our stores, and then they wipe out our toilet paper, our paper towels, our food sources. And so we really have to be mindful in our rural areas about focusing on the safe and healthy of others. One of the biggest things we're finding is the digital divide. We hear that a lot in the urban areas as well, but in 2019, 63% of rural adults had broadband, were broadband users. And so many of our rural families that do have internet, it isn't broadband. Where I live is wireless. I had to drive to work today for the webinar because if my wife's on, my 2 granddaughters are trying to do their schoolwork, and I'm on a webinar, and then everybody else in the area is also on wireless since they're at home, it's just not predictable. And so we lack a lot of predictable internet. And then geographically, we can't even get internet in some places or even cell phone service. So oftentimes we're working with families that will live in a canyon or have a lot of trees around, and we can't even access them with the cell phone. And so that's a big issue we're trying to overcome. And in our district, how we're doing that is we're working with AT&T. We're looking at grants to try to put hotspots around the community and outside in our outlying areas, even putting antennas on people's houses. We've had good luck, asking people, hey, we need to try to get internet 20 miles out past you. Could we throw an antenna up on your house? And so in order to overcome that divide, we're trying to get creative in reaching out to those families and giving them some sort of access. Along with that, as we're doing our individual distance learning plans, we have to decide how we're going to provide those services. Will we be doing face-to-face? Will we be driving out when we deliver food on the bus to give some quick instruction and hand out packets to overcome that digital divide? And so that goes to the next one with delivery of learning materials. That some of the students that don't have internet or cell phone service, we've had to get real creative where we're delivering meals with our buses and using our paras to help make meals. That's been great to help the community because we're able to keep people working, like the bus drivers, the paras, and then we're trying to organize our efforts so that they can deliver learning materials as they deliver the food as well. So that's been something that was a challenge for us to overcome at first, and we finally figured it out. Some of our neighboring districts, they're only doing grab and go lunches, and they're having very little success with the grab and go because people won't drive into town to come get a school lunch. So if you're doing that, you might consider seeing if you can use buses to deliver those learning materials and deliver those lunches. Then of course, staffing, we're always short staffed in the rural areas on a normal basis. And even now we're cooking more lunches in a week than we do in a month right now. And so our staff is really overworked. And so trying to come up with a way to rotate that, but then going back to our strength, reaching out to our communities, and we've had tons of volunteers helping with that. And so we're relying on them to help us as we've asked parents to become teachers. Kevin, go ahead and change that, would you please? So we also in the rural areas tend to have a high rate of essential workers. Most of us are in agriculture and nature, timber products, food industry, oil. And so a lot of our parents are at work. And we've ran into issues where the students are at daycare, or they're with an extended family member, or they might be at work with the parent if they have a small business. And so they're not able to do as much schoolwork as we would like them to do sometimes, or our teachers would. And we've been working with our teachers about this is the time to not be judgmental. Every one of us are in a different situation. And if parents are working all day long, especially in some of these harder labor jobs, they're tired, they're wore out, they really don't have time to do as much education as we would like with our students. So now's the time to work with each parent, work with each student when we build those individual learning plans of what they can do, and be very cognizant of not making more stress in the family unit than they already have at the moment. And then we have students working. We've had a lot of our students right now, our agricultural process is gearing up, they're planning. We have a lot of students working right now, high school students, middle school students, and so they're not able to get to as much schoolwork as we would like. So we have to be very cognizant of their time, their efforts, and that they're working. And then in the rural areas, we have a lot of people taking care of extended family. We don't have as many nursing homes. We don't have as many home care assistants. And so we also have students at home that are now taking care of grandmas, grandpas. They're also doing childcare for their parents that are part of that essential workforce. And so they don't have time to do as much schoolwork as we would like either. And then in our frontier areas especially, we're seeing a lot of pressure to reopen schools because we've had low cases of the virus. And so parents that are essential workers, the community are like, hey, let's get our schools open. We're not seeing as many cases as they are in the more urban areas. But our state Board of Education has come out with some guidelines that it's really hard for us to meet in our rural and frontier areas with the cleaning and the personal protective equipment. And so we have to be real careful as we have this pressure that we're following your state guidelines. You're working with your healthcare providers to decide if it's safe to go ahead and open up schools, because back to our case focus number one, if we open too soon and everybody gets sick, we could certainly create a huge strain on our rural areas. Go ahead, Kevin, if you would. So to wrap it up, back to case priority 2, if you've been watching the webinars, is, we're trying to provide FAPE as best we can. We're working with other rural areas. This is the individual distance learning plans. We think this is key. There was the sample on webinar 1 that is on the case website that we took and adapted to our needs. But involving families, involving students, and creating these individual distance learning plans on what they can do based on their situation, whether it's lack of internet, or they're an essential worker. But those are key for us as we move into the future as well. And then remember to get staff to meet families and students where they are, and not be judgmental about where they are, because we're all in different areas in our life right now. And to really consider low-tech options. We see a lot of stuff about places going online, fully online, and we just can't do that in our rural area. I mean, we've had parents say, hey, could you please provide hard copies, because we're using our student to work in the family business and they can't log on to a computer, but during a break they can sit down and do some learning packets. So again, those individual distance learning plans are key to us. And then for us, it's telling your story. Priority 3, document, document, document. Ask staff to keep good parent logs, and then tell your story with written notice. Why are you doing what you're doing? And hopefully it's in conjunction with parents. Go ahead and change that, Kevin. And I just like this quote. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it. But really, Julie Weatherly said it earlier, is nobody really knows the answers right now. And I think each one of us needs to look at our own unique situations, much like an IEP or an individualized distance learning plan. And then we need to look to places like CASE, CEC, our state departments, the people that we really think are providing the best guidance. And then we have to pick and choose out of that guidance what fits our best interest, our students' best interest, our community's best interest, and run with it, and just be nimble and ready to react if it doesn't work. Because right now, I really believe nobody knows anything, like Pete's quote says at the end, and we just need to all keep moving forward as best we can with the best knowledge we can find. And Kevin, you're on.
Thank you so much. Our next question here is actually for Erin. So Erin, can you talk a little bit about what districts need to do in order to consider the effects of COVID-19 school closure during the next IEP?
Yes, thanks for that question, Kevin. That's one that many of my special educators are asking me on a regular basis. So in our last webinar, we talked about the importance of measuring the impact of COVID-19. We're really looking to consider where students were when they left in-person instruction and make sure we know where they are at the end of all of this, at the end of the school year, and consider that as the impact of COVID-19 on IEP goal progress. And that information is something that we will be considering into the future. There are a couple of ways we're going to do that. We'll be doing that both potentially in the summer if we're able to have in-person instruction and try to think about how we use our CARES dollars to maybe address some of those learning deficits that will take place. And then also we will definitely be using it when we return in order to think about what interventions are the best interventions for students when we start the next school year. And so therefore, inside of our annual IEP process, those conversations will need to take place. It is not our intention to consider those decisions within the construct of compensatory education, but are more within the construct of the importance of addressing the impact of COVID-19. We believe that that's a critical body of work that we all need to be thinking about as we consider what's best for our students. And while we are not thinking about it in that frame of reference, because we are providing through our distance learning plans, FAPE under the circumstances presently, we will be working into the next annual IEP and into the next school year to try to address those in really creative ways. So absolutely, it's important to think about the measurement of the impact of COVID-19 on progress on IEP goals and think collectively as a team, and also I would offer as a system moving forward to think about what to do and how to best address that for individual students. So thanks for that question, Kevin. I'd like to now hand it over to Dr. Adam Leckie, who is our case publications chair. He is an assistant superintendent, is going to talk with you a little bit about supporting your superintendent through COVID-19. Many of you are working in roles in leadership. All of you probably are in some type of leadership role, teacher leaders, as well as directors, and how we need to think about supporting superintendents. The superintendency is an incredibly challenging position right now, trying to navigate all of this. And so Adam, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about how we can support the leaders of our systems in the work around special education during this challenging time.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate all the work that CASE is doing to keep people connected to the network and to continue to problem solve as we move forward. So with that, like Erin said, I am an assistant superintendent in Arizona. So good afternoon to everyone, and then my fellow Arizonas, it's still morning for us. I've been an assistant superintendent for 3 years, working in a mid-sized district in Arizona. And we're kind of a little bit rural too, so I really appreciated some of the strategies and problems and solutions that Kindel offered for us. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some strategies and general advice for us as we continue to collaborate and work, not only with the superintendent, but with board members and with other colleagues in our cabinet to problem solve and kind of work through this. So if we can go ahead and advance the slide one. Thank you. So I had to kind of think about how I was going to frame the conversation, and really this, I think, is the easiest to understand specific strategies for how we want to move forward, and particularly in dealing with working with your superintendent. So I was a special ed director previous to being assistant superintendent, and I actually have a very unique and interesting superintendent that I work with, and if he was on the webinar, he'd laugh right now. Which has given me a good opportunity to think about different and creative ways for us to approach this. So really, I want you guys to think about the 4 C's of kind of our approach to working with those in the superintendency and in the board. And really that's framed around communication, collaboration, confidence, and creativity. So I want to talk more specifically about what that means and how we've kind of used that to frame our interaction. So if we want to move one slide. Thank you. So we all know how important communication is, and most of the things I'm going to talk to you about today are not groundbreaking. A lot of it is common sense. And a lot of it is general because each district and LEA is, and even school is really specific and context dependent. But I want us to be reminded of the importance of this. And first, that clear channel of communication, however that's set up in your district, you need to utilize that. I know in our district, we utilize an incident command system, and the communication plan is a part of that. But whatever process you use, make sure it's understood by all parties. We need to be really intentional about the messaging we send. And even though we tend to be hyper-focused in our own areas, those messages need to be aligned and they need to be clear to parents. And so when you think about your communication strategies, make sure you're involving your PIO if you're lucky enough to have one, or whoever your point person is. And often, because of the nature of our work, we can lend our advice and our guidance to crafting messages that aren't even about special ed themselves, but because we are so intentional and specific about the language that we use, we have a lot to offer in that area. The second thing is, my best advice of all the things I'm going to say today is to be honest and upfront with your superintendent. I know that the cultures of each school district can depend a little bit on the personalities, but you don't move forward if you don't address issues in a clear and honest manner. So be upfront. But when you are upfront with those challenges, be ready with a solution. All right. So if you go to a superintendent, they don't want to just hear all the problems that you're having, the challenges. They want to hear what you think is your best approach to addressing that. And then to go back to case priority number 3, data is your friend. When you present those challenges and the reasons why you make a suggestion for how to solve those issues, make sure you utilize and back that up with data. That's really important. And then the last thing that sometimes gets masked is just understanding your superintendent's perspective. Before I was in this position, I didn't really understand the role of the superintendent as well, but your superintendent is really focused on working with the board members in the district and managing those personalities. And that takes up a lot of time. They're going to be the ones demanding a lot from your superintendent answers, and then he's going to rely on his staff to really provide him the information. The other thing to think about too is in special education, we are really nationally focused. Our work is governed by a federal law, and that really frames a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the information we seek. But often school district superintendents are more focused on state issues and the state budget, the state legislature, state laws. They understand the perspective of that national information and the things they need to be aware of, but what drives their daily work is often on a state level. So just understanding that and working through that will be helpful. So if we want to advance the slide. So the second thing is collaboration. I can't highlight this enough. Be adamant about the need to be at the table. And we always talk about this in special ed. We don't want to be left behind, but it's more important now than it ever was before. Equity issues with students, and in particular students with disabilities, are being highlighted by this pandemic and being exacerbated. And it's helpful as a system to make sure that you're collaborating so that those approaches, whichever you take as a district, are integrated and they support one another. And so just make sure that you are at those meetings, you are part of those conversations, and advocate for that. And look for those opportunities. Look for those opportunities where special education and the things that we've done to navigate this up to this point can be used to support a lot of the other challenges that other departments are doing. Use that experience, use the complexity of our work to help guide decision making in other areas. Let's show people why we have such a good background and knowledge and expertise, and why a special ed director is so important for a school district, because we have a lot to offer beyond just dealing with our students with disabilities. And then the other thing too to think about with complexity is your superintendent really wants to understand and is concerned about the legal ramifications and also the budget. And so those are things that you want to highlight when you talk to them, when you're working with other departments, because those have long-term implications, and that's a really critical area for a superintendent to manage. And those are issues where superintendents often may lose their jobs over budgeting issues. So it's really important that we focus on that as we move forward. If we can move the slide, please. This one, I just wanted to be upfront. We have to be confident in our knowledge base. And we talk about this. If you've ever joined us for our Special Education Leadership Summit, I think that's a great analogy for what we should be doing now. We go up to the Hill and we meet with all of these senators and representatives who have status and clout. But you know what? We're the experts in our field. Be the expert. Be the person that has the information, that has the strategy, that has the solutions. You have to be informed about that. It's critical to know not only what's going on within your state, but on a national level so that you can be that conduit of information. So when you get a question from an assistant superintendent or a superintendent about something that came from the Department of Ed, you're already there ready to frame that conversation in the right way. And of course, in order to do that, we really stress leverage your national and your state networks. CASE is absolutely the primary means to do that. I think by you attending this webinar that shows and demonstrates that you are doing just that, but you got to use those networks, leverage those, problem solve with colleagues. That's critical. You should not be on an island right now because the entire nation is dealing with the same issue. We're all navigating that under the same law, federal law. So we all have to collaborate on strategies as we move forward. Okay, we can advance the slide. Okay, finally, this one might seem a little unique to put in here as far as strategies to support your superintendent, but I think it's really, really important. We need to be creative and highlight that creativity. I have been amazed at the numerous strategies and creative solutions that my colleagues both in Arizona and across the nation have come up with to address these challenges. We need to showcase those. We need to highlight those. We need to know and make others know how unique the situation is and how unprecedented our challenges are and what we have in our toolkit to address those challenges. We need to share those out. We need to make sure our colleagues know what we're doing. There's no right answer. Kindel said it before. There is no right answer, and I've told my colleagues this as well. We all are kind of navigating blindly through this. So if we're afraid to put what we're doing out there for fear that someone will say that's the wrong thing, then I think we're all going to be undermined in our approach. We have to share everything. And of course, there's going to be ideas that you never had that you can latch onto, but I guarantee you've solved a problem in your district that somebody else is struggling with. So I just wanted to highlight those 4 C's. Think about those: communication, collaboration, creativity, and confidence as you move forward with your superintendent. But the most important thing is know your personalities, know your superintendent, understand the operating structure of your district, know how those personalities interact and what your best approach is. So it's really context dependent. So hopefully that was somewhat helpful. I know it was a lot of general information and things that you may have already known, but I think if you highlight those strategies, you're going to be a little bit more effective. So with that, I appreciate the time, and I'd like to hand it back over to Erin, who will address another frequently asked question.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that great information. Kevin, another question for you. What should we do if we do not have enough formal data to make eligibility decisions for our evaluations right now?
It's a really good question. I think that you're going to have to do this just as we always do in special education. You're going to have to be making these decisions on a case-by-case basis. So I know that in our district, for those situations, especially where observations are required in a typical class environment, and really what's typical right now in terms of a classroom environment, we are really engaging with parents and families to have a legitimate conversation about what data we do have that we gathered pre-pandemic, what data we gather right now, and is it really legitimate data? Does it really represent what is going on with the student in our school district? and to really have an open and honest conversation with parents and families about what's going on here. There also might be some additional things that have come up during the pandemic that we may need to take a closer look at. So is the student experiencing new stresses or anxieties or things that are going on at home that were not necessarily being experienced at school? And so you need to consider those things in the context of those open evaluations, and then and do that on a case-by-case basis, and then wrap up those evaluations within the typical timelines. Right now, while there are not any flexibilities being given by the federal government, I know that, for example, in Michigan, since their timelines were always shorter, that they have granted some additional flexibilities related to initial timelines and that sort of thing. So you're going to want to make sure that you are finishing up those evaluations within the reasonable timelines and working with parents and families on an individual basis to make sure that it represents what's appropriate for that child.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. As a reminder, you all are welcome to type questions and send those in. We will have a little bit of time at the end of this presentation to answer them. And we continue to collect frequently asked questions, and we'll build those into future presentations. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Heath Heine, who is our Professional Development Chair, and we are grateful to have him here with us. He is an expert in MTSS and is going to talk a little bit about MTSS for return to school planning, with a bit of a teaser for a future webinar on this topic, which we think is really important and an exciting way to think about the work to come. Heath?
Thank you, Erin. Kevin, if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, I want to start by asking you a question. Where are you focused at right now? You may be focusing on the instruction your staff is involved in now, ESY, or you may even be looking toward the future and considering how you can ensure your students recover academically and behaviorally from the crisis. It's likely that your focus is being pulled in a lot of different directions. And maybe that isn't your experience right now, but I know it's my experience. That was until I saw a couple of resources that got me thinking where I might need to begin to focus. Next slide, please. One resource was this article from John Hattie. It discusses research that has been done in many areas pertinent to our current situation. It has research regarding the losses during school closures due to a crisis, what to expect during distance learning. Some of my takeaways were that academic losses might be less than we fear, and the growth we gain from distance learning might be less than we hope. We need to learn from the successes and struggles of this experience and improve how we educate students in the future. Next slide, please. The second resource that helped me to focus was this tweet that came from Michael Pollan. I've heard Michael Pollan described as the world's leading expert in school change, and I found his words here to be very powerful. My perception of this quote aligns very well with what I read in the article from Professor Hattie. The gains we see from our students during this time of closure may be very limited. And maybe we need to begin to have a strong focus on improving our systems when we return. Many of us already have systems in place, such as an MTSS framework. Even if you don't have a formal system in place, you could easily implement something like Professor Hattie's DIE model, which stands for Diagnose, Intervene, Implement, and Evaluate. Next slide, please. These models are an excellent fit for what our students will need when they return. They will help guide us toward student needs and away from decisions that may stress the system and lack impact. As we transition back into our buildings, or even before, we may be tempted to begin providing extra supplemental instruction. Many of us may not have the resources to provide this supplemental instruction either now or during the school year. Also, simply double dosing on instruction may not have a significant effect on students' growth. This is where an MTSS framework or the DIE model fit perfectly. If we begin planning now, we can all improve the systems and support we have in place for our students when they return. Our focus at that time must be on how we can accelerate learning for all students. While the negative impact of the closure is important, it is not as important as the impact we will have on our students moving forward. It will be vital that we begin by gaining a clear understanding of where our students are in their learning before we start making changes to our instruction. Once we have identified our students' needs, we can address those needs in the ways research say are most likely to accelerate learning. Planning for MTSS now will allow you to be ready to meet the varied needs of all students. Regardless of the model that you have in place, MTSS, DIE, or others, these 5 questions are keys that you should consider moving forward to help improve your system and the impact that you will have on student learning. I invite you to join me for a webinar on May 12th, where we will learn how we can improve the systems we have in place, or even develop a structure that can support all students, teachers, and buildings using these 5 questions. More information will be available at a later time, and I hope to see you all there. All right, back to Kevin.
Thanks so much, Heath. So our next question and last question in our little commercials here with frequently asked questions is going to go to Erin. So Erin, what do you think 504 plans should be looking like during this time where there are, I think I read yesterday, 41 out of the 50 states are closed for the remainder of the school year for in-person instruction?
Thanks for that question and that statistic, which is just so hard to hear. I miss students and families and teachers. I'm sure all of you do. 504 is an important conversation. I hope many of you have visited the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights website, and taken a look at some of the resources that they've put out. They've made it very clear that all of the work that we're doing to provide education to students must be accessible to students who are eligible for special education, but also are protected under Section 504. 504 plans should be reviewed in the context of COVID-19. Some of the accommodations in 504 plans or other supports in 504 plans may very well address the needs of students under the current circumstances. That's absolutely possible. There may also need to be additional supports added into 504 plans in order to address those needs. Our system did not choose to write distance learning plans under 504. What we chose to do instead was to take all of the 504 plans, take a look at them, engage with families, and figure out whether or not there were any special accommodations or supports that were necessary for students who were eligible for protection under 504 in order to meet their needs. Specifically, assistive technology and thinking about accessibility within the context of the online learning is a very important question to be asking. It is a different learning platform. It's a different learning environment. And we know that 504 is particularly sensitive to environmental factors and what's needed for students to ensure that they have an equal playing field, even if there is an impacting disability. And so we made alterations to 504s. We created some temporary accommodations for 504s based on the circumstances. And we did so in collaboration with families, as is expected under Section 504. One of the benefits of 504 protection and the process under that is that unless your state has decided otherwise, there are not complex teaming expectations that are in place as under special education. And so we are able to have conversations with families and add those accommodations or supports that are necessary under the circumstances. Again, it is important that we can carefully consider 504 in the context of COVID-19. So with that, I would like to go ahead and hand it back over to Phyllis for a review of our 4 priorities, as well as supporting us through any questions that we might have.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for the presentations today. It was so great to hear so many people, each of our presenters kind of weave in the 4 priorities as part of their presentations today. They were just extraordinary, and we've got quite a few questions coming up here, and we have a little more time to answer them. So reminder of the 4 priorities, the focus on health and safety, providing FAPE in most reasonable way possible, documenting your efforts, and realizing that compliance at this time in a pandemic will be difficult. So I'm going to skip on to the questions because I want to be sure that we get some of these in. And I'm going to take this first question to, let's throw this one to Adam, and then maybe Kindel, in case you have some direction from that more rural area. How can we complete evaluations that require face-to-face testing when we have stay-at-home orders from our state? Evaluation tools have not been normed for virtual applications. Adam?
Yeah, great question. I know this one comes up quite often. I've had many conversations about this with colleagues. My best advice is, in every instance feasible, to agree that the validity of the assessment and evaluation is of the first priority. And so, if at all possible, to delay that to ensure that we can do a proper evaluation. If schools and districts have made the decision that they want to explore alternative methods of evaluation, my recommendation there would be, and I believe Kevin had talked about this on a previous webinar, is really to work with the evaluating publishing company to determine how those assessments can be given with validity online. My greatest concern with doing that is that the environment is not controllable from the student's end. And so we don't know what additional factors may be playing into distractibility or context that may limit the ability to interpret that assessment with confidence. But I think that this is another opportunity for us to see how we can deliver evaluations through alternative methods. And I know that that's been done. There have been numerous districts and companies who have been doing training that can probably assist you if that's the direction you choose to go. And like I said, it just would be prudent to have conversations with families to make sure that we understand the implications of the evaluation being conducted now versus the evaluation being conducted when schools resume.
Right.
And I don't know if Kindel might want to add anything on the ground from his perspective.
Yeah, actually I would, Adam. So one of the things we've been asking our evaluators is to rethink, do you really need that assessment at this time? Because sometimes we've seen our folks get in a rut where they're just kind of always doing the same evaluations for evaluation's sake. And oftentimes we may not need that information. We may already have great progress monitoring data that can help us make those decisions for eligibility, based on the criteria that each state sets. So we've been really asking them, do we really want to stay with the status quo even when we come back? And let's really take a hard look at some of the assessments we're giving, and do we need them? And the last piece of that I would add is, if you can't do the face-to-face, remember that's where we tell our story using our written notice explaining why we can't do the face-to-face at this time, and then to also write in a plan, when will we do the face-to-face?
Thanks, Kindel. I'm going to ask Julie this question. Kindel kind of mentioned using prior written notice, but Julie, if you could respond to this question. If assessments are needed for an initial or additional data needed, how do you go to eligibility without that data? If the parents are in agreement to get extension, can we do a prior written notice and collect data later?
Great question, and we continue to get this one on pretty much a daily basis, Phyllis. Well, a lot of this hinges on state requirements in terms of what eligibility requires, and dotting those I's and crossing those T's under your state code rules or regulations. And if you don't have the data, many state folks will say, then you can't find the child eligible. My experience thus far has been that when good conversations are had with parents with respect to the inability to complete certain assessments necessary for eligibility, parents are in full agreement. I have not heard of one instance so far where a parent is not understanding of the fact that we just can't do it. And a lot of the evaluators are very concerned about the validity of their data, depending on what kind of evaluation they're doing. So talking all of those things through with parents and then documenting that we had that conversation, to me, the discussion is the notice. I don't know that, prior written notice has to be provided under these circumstances. Again, we're kind of making up the rules as we go along. So I have more documentation than we need, but certainly we want to document that we gave parent notice and that the parent agreed and that we would get back together, which is important to make sure that we get whatever we need done in a timely fashion when we can.
All right. Thank you, Julie. I'm going to ask Erin if she would answer this question. I know that we've had many conversations about this, but this continues to be a question, I think, for many around compensatory education. So the question is, can you offer language to use other than compensatory education? We have many parents and groups reaching out with that language after they've participated in presentations from their interest groups.
That is a great question, and I have had that same experience. I will share with you what I have been saying, which is that our individualized distance learning plans that were offered at the point of closure represent FAPE under the circumstances, and that we are not presently denying FAPE as we are going through this crisis. What I am talking about is measuring the impact of COVID-19 on the progress of IEP goals and actively sharing with families that we will be talking about that and figuring out together what to do. That compensatory education is not, from my perspective, the appropriate legal remedy. I would share with you that I think it's very important that you talk with your district attorney before you begin to use that language. I did, and our district attorney is supporting that perspective. She's done a review of our processes and procedures for delivering distance learning plans, making those decisions. We have made distance learning plans basically an addendum to the IEP. It is part of the IEP in my school district. That distance learning plan is covered by parental rights, can be subject to due process, and is the district's offer of FAPE during this time. So because we've crossed all of those bridges and dotted those I's and crossed those T's, that is how we're thinking about that. If, however, you have not offered FAPE and been clear about that during this time, it is possible that you may be subject to a compensatory education claim if you haven't offered FAPE. It's related to the answer to Kevin's question that he answered in the beginning of this webinar, is it better to do nothing? And my perspective is that there is an argument that FAPE is being denied if people are not providing a FAPE under the circumstances. But given the way that we're approaching it, we really feel like we have done everything we can to offer everything we can under the circumstances and done that in a legally compliant way. We will be measuring the impact of COVID-19 on performance, and we will then be talking about what to do about that. Just because I'm not calling it compensatory education doesn't mean we're ignoring the issue or pretending like that isn't happening. We will be talking about it. It's just not due to a denial of FAPE from the school district as is articulated by compensatory education. So I've been talking about that with my parent groups and my parents to try to address that issue.
Thank you, Erin. We have gone a few minutes over. I would ask that our presenters, our panelists, come back on camera just so that you can get a nice look and say thank you to them, whether that's virtually or through the chat box, through the questions. I would also bring your attention to, as Erin and Heath also talked about, compensatory education and what's in the future. How do we respond? On May the 12th, we will be offering another webinar. We do not have the registration up just yet, but that is coming. The use of MTSS for return to school. Heath Heine will be offering that for us We are looking forward to this great session, have been doing some planning with regard to this already. Please save the date on your calendar. Registration information will be coming soon. Please continue to look to the website. This recording, as well as the PowerPoint, will be located there within the next hour, if not sooner. And again, we will come back and meet with you next Friday. We anticipate that the Secretary will have presented some information to Congress. We'll see what comes out. Next week, our focus will probably return back to the compliance aspects and what we do with timelines and have any flexibilities been granted. So please stay tuned. Thank each and every one of you for being a part of our webinar today. We have so appreciated your expertise and your sharing and your time. Thank you.